In the year 930, in the middle of the Hajj season, when Mecca was packed with pilgrims who had traveled hundreds of miles to complete one of the 5 pillars of their faith, an armed force rode into the holy city, killed thousands of those pilgrims where they stood, threw bodies into the sacred well of Zamzam, and then walked straight into the most protected structure in the Islamic world. What they took next wasn't gold. It wasn't treasure. It was a single black stone, set into the corner of the Kaaba, a stone every Muslim on earth had been taught to revere since childhood. And then they simply left, carrying it hundreds of miles away. And for the next 23 years, the holiest site in Islam sat with an empty socket where the black stone should have been. This is the true story of the single most audacious theft in Islamic history, and the group that pulled it off believed, sincerely, that they were doing the right thing. To understand how something like this could even happen, you have to understand what the black stone actually meant and still means to Islam. Known in Arabic as the Hajar al-Aswad, the black stone sits embedded in the eastern corner of the Kaaba, inside the Grand Mosque in Mecca. According to Islamic tradition, it was given to the Prophet Ibrahim, known in the Bible as Abraham, to help mark the corner of the Kaaba as he and his son Ismail rebuilt the structure. To this day, Muslims performing Hajj or Umrah try to touch or kiss the stone as they circle the Kaaba 7 times, a gesture said to echo the moment Prophet Muhammad himself once kissed it. It's not worshipped, and Islamic teaching is explicit about that distinction. The stone itself holds no divine power, but it is treated as one of the most sacred physical objects connected to the faith's origins, a stone that has anchored the ritual heart of Islam for over 14 centuries. Long before 930, the stone had already survived violence. In 683, during a siege of Mecca under the Umayyad Caliphate, catapult fire struck the Kaaba, and the stone was reportedly cracked and blackened, later repaired and bound together with a silver ligament by Abd Allah ibn al-Zubayr, the local leader defending the city at the time. So the stone that stood in the Kaaba in 930 was already a survivor, already bound in silver from an earlier act of violence. Nobody expected what was coming next. The group responsible called themselves the Karmatians, and their story doesn't start with theft. It starts with grievance. They emerged from a radical offshoot of Ismaili Shia Islam in the late 9th century, founded by a preacher named Hamdan Karmat, based largely in what is now eastern Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. From the very beginning, they positioned themselves in direct opposition to the ruling Abbasid Caliphate centered in Baghdad, viewing the empire's leadership as corrupt and its religious authority as illegitimate. Over the following decades, the Karmatians built a genuinely radical society for their time, according to multiple historical accounts, one that redistributed wealth communally and rejected several mainstream Islamic obligations, including pointedly the pilgrimage to Mecca itself. To the Karmatians, Hajj wasn't a sacred duty. It was viewed by their leadership as a superstition that funneled wealth and religious authority toward Mecca and the Abbasid establishment they despised. That ideological hostility didn't stay theoretical for long. Through the early 900s, the Karmatians built military and economic power by raiding trade routes and pilgrim caravans traveling south through Abbasid territory toward Mecca, wealth that funded further expansion and recruitment. By the 920s, under the leadership of Abu Tahir al-Jannabi, who took control of the movement as a teenager after his father's death, the Karmatians had grown bold enough to attack major Abbasid cities directly, sacking Basra in 923 and Kufa in 927, and even threatening Baghdad itself, the seat of the entire caliphate. Abu Tahir wasn't some minor regional warlord causing local trouble. By his mid-20s, he was one of the most feared military leaders in the Islamic world, commanding a force capable of humiliating the Abbasid Caliphate on its own doorstep. That ideological hostility didn't stay theoretical for long. Through the early 900s, the Karmatians built military and economic power by raiding trade routes and pilgrim caravans traveling south through Abbasid territory toward Mecca, wealth that funded further expansion and recruitment. By the 920s, under the leadership of Abu Tahir al-Jannabi, who took control of the movement as a teenager after his father's death, the Karmatians had grown bold enough to attack major Abbasid cities directly, sacking Basra in 923 and Kufa in 927, and even threatening Baghdad itself, the seat of the entire caliphate. Abu Tahir wasn't some minor regional warlord causing local trouble. By his mid-20s, he was one of the most feared military leaders in the Islamic world, commanding a force capable of humiliating the Abbasid Caliphate on its own doorstep. It's worth understanding just how unusual the society Abu Tahir was defending actually was, because it makes the ideological motive behind the raid on Mecca much clearer. Historical accounts describe the Carmatian state centered at Al-Aqsa as one built around a kind of radical internal equality that was almost unheard of in the region at the time, a leadership structure in which wealth was pooled and redistributed among the community, and the traditional pillars of mainstream Islamic practice, including the pilgrimage to Mecca, were treated as tools of political and religious control, rather than genuine spiritual obligations. From inside that worldview, Mecca wasn't simply a city they disagreed with. It was viewed as the physical headquarters of the exact religious establishment the Carmatians had built their entire movement in opposition to. Pilgrims who had traveled to fulfill one of the most sacred obligations of their faith were killed inside the sanctuary itself, an act considered a severe violation even by the standards of warfare at the time, since the sanctity of Mecca was traditionally supposed to protect anyone inside it, even during conflict. Historical accounts describe the Carmatians desecrating the well of Zamzam, the same well Muslims believe miraculously sprang from the ground to save the infant Ismail and his mother Hajar, by filling it with the bodies of the dead. They looted the treasures kept inside and around the Kaaba, wealth accumulated over centuries from pilgrims and rulers alike. And then came the moment that made this raid different from every other act of violence the Abbasid world had endured. Abu Tahir ordered the black stone physically hewn from its place in the corner of the Kaaba. Not stolen quietly, not smuggled out. Removed, deliberately, in what many contemporary chroniclers described as a final, calculated act of desecration, not simply theft for profit. The stone was then transported hundreds of miles to the Carmatian capital at Al-Aqsa, in what is now Bahrain. According to later historians, including the Ottoman-era chronicler Qutb al-Din, Abu Tahir went so far as to install the black stone inside his own mosque, the Masjid al-Dirar, an act widely interpreted as an attempt to redirect the pilgrimage away from Mecca entirely and toward Carmatian territory instead. This wasn't simply a raid that happened to end in a valuable item being carried off. Based on how deliberately it was carried out and where it ended up, this looks like a targeted attempt to strike at the symbolic and spiritual center of the Islamic world itself. The reaction across the Muslim world was, understandably, immense. For the next 23 years, pilgrims performing Hajj arrived at the Kaaba to find an empty socket where the black stone had sat for as long as anyone could remember. The ritual continued. Hajj continued. But the absence of the stone remained a raw, visible wound at the center of Islam's holiest site for over 2 decades. Chroniclers writing in the decades that followed described the shock rippling far beyond Mecca itself, reaching Abbasid courts, rival Islamic scholars, and ordinary pilgrims who had grown up believing that whatever else happened in the world, the sanctuary at Mecca stood untouchable. That assumption had just been shattered publicly during the exact season when the city was supposed to be at its most protected. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad reportedly offered a ransom of 50,000 dinars, an enormous sum for the era, to have it returned. Abu Tahir refused. Money was never really the point. The stone finally came back in 952, and even its return carried an air of theatrical defiance. By the time that return finally happened, Abu Tahir himself was no longer part of the story. He died in 944, 14 years after the raid on Mecca and 8 years before the stone was finally sent back, reportedly from smallpox rather than in battle, an oddly quiet ending for a man whose name had once been enough to make an entire caliphate tremble. Leadership of the Carmatian state passed on within his family, and it was under his successors, facing growing pressure from the Fatimid Caliphate, itself a rival Ismaili power that had no interest in being associated with the massacre at Mecca, that the eventual decision to return the stone was made. Some historical accounts suggest the Carmatians had also concluded, after more than 2 decades, that holding the stone had failed to achieve its original purpose. Pilgrims never stopped traveling to Mecca. Hajj never rerouted to Al-Aqsa. The empty socket in the Kaaba became its own kind of monument, a visible, unhealed absence that, if anything, seemed to deepen the Muslim world's devotion to reclaiming what had been taken rather than accepting a substitute. According to multiple historical accounts, the stone was wrapped and delivered, seemingly on the order of the Fatimid Caliph in Egypt, and left at a mosque in Kufa with a note attached, reading, roughly translated, "By command we took it, and by command we have brought it back." No apology, no explanation beyond that single chilling line. When the stone was finally reset into the Kaaba, it reportedly returned broken into several pieces, requiring it to be reassembled and bound once again, joining the earlier cracks from the 683 siege into a single fractured relic. That fractured silver-bound stone, repaired across multiple centuries of violence, is the same stone still embedded in the Kaaba's eastern corner today, still touched and kissed by millions of pilgrims every single year, most of whom have no idea it once vanished from Mecca entirely for nearly a quarter of a century. It's worth pausing here to address something directly, because history like this can easily get flattened into simple sectarian shorthand, and that would genuinely miss the point. The Karmatians were not representative of Shia Islam as a whole, and mainstream scholars across both Sunni and Shia traditions at the time condemned the sack of Mecca as a horrifying and illegitimate act of violence against Islam's holiest site, not a legitimate expression of religious disagreement. Even within Ismaili Shia thought, the Karmatians were considered a radical, breakaway faction, one whose beliefs and actions were rejected by the broader Fatimid Caliphate, itself an Ismaili Shia power, which is precisely why later historical accounts credit Fatimid pressure with eventually forcing the stone's return. This wasn't a clean story of one branch of Islam attacking another. It was a fringe militant movement, condemned broadly across the Islamic world at the time, carrying out an act that horrified nearly everyone, regardless of sect. What makes this story so difficult to look away from, even more than 1,000 years later, is how deliberately symbolic the entire act was. Abu Tahir didn't need the black stone for wealth. It wasn't gold, it wasn't jewels, it held no market value in the way looted treasure normally does. He took it because of exactly what it represented, the literal, physical center of Islamic spiritual authority, and by ripping it out of Mecca and relocating it to his own mosque, he was attempting something far more audacious than theft. He was trying to physically relocate the gravitational center of an entire religion's most sacred ritual. It didn't work. Hajj continued flowing toward Mecca regardless. Pilgrims continued the ritual around an empty socket for over 2 decades rather than redirect their devotion elsewhere, and eventually, whether through military pressure, political maneuvering by the Fatimids, or a combination of both, the stone made its way back to where it had sat for centuries before Abu Tahir's men ever rode into the city. Today, if you watch footage of the Hajj, millions of pilgrims circling the Kaaba, many of them straining just to touch or kiss that same cornerstone, you're looking at an object that survived catapult fire in 683, an armed massacre and forced removal in 930, 23 years in exile inside a rival mosque built specifically to replace it, and a broken, reassembled return journey back to Mecca in 952. Every crack visible in that silver-bound stone today is a physical record of that history, still sitting exactly where Ibrahim is said to have placed it, still touched by pilgrims who, more than 1,000 years later, never stopped coming back to it. And the Karmatian state that carried out the raid didn't even outlast the stone's return by much in historical terms, gradually losing power over the following decades until it was ultimately dissolved by the 11th century, leaving behind little more than this single, staggering episode as the thing history remembers them for. If stories like this, the ones history rarely tells in full, are exactly what you're here for, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of this history still waiting to be uncovered.